Maya Chen had always hated winter. Not the aesthetic winter that appeared on greeting cards and in romantic movies. The winter of gentle snowflakes and cozy fireplaces and hot chocolate that steamed with cinematic perfection. She hated the real winter, the kind that made her apartment's heating bill triple, that turned sidewalks into obstacle courses of ice and slush, that arrived in November and overstayed its welcome until April, bringing with it 4 months of gray skies and the persistent feeling that the sun had given up on the entire Northeast. But Maya had especially hated winter since her grandmother's death 3 years ago, because winter was when Rose Chen had been most alive. Rose had loved the first snowfall of the season, with the enthusiasm of someone who had never lost her capacity to be delighted by weather, that treated each flake as an individual miracle, rather than a collective inconvenience. Maya, Rose used to say during the first snow of each year, this is when the world becomes a library. Every snowflake is a story, and every story is unique, and if you pay attention, you can read the tales that winter tells when no one else is listening. Maya had never understood what her grandmother meant by this, just as she had never understood most of Rose's cryptic statements about stories, books, and the mysterious ways that narratives chose their readers, instead of the other way around. Rose had owned a small bookshop in Chinatown called Between the Lines, but she had operated it more like a matchmaking service than a business, introducing books to customers with the careful attention of someone arranging marriages between compatible souls. Maya had worked at Between the Lines every summer during high school, shelving inventory and processing sales while Rose performed her mysterious rituals of literary connection. Maya had watched her grandmother recommend romance novels to widowed men, children's books to adults going through divorces, and poetry collections to teenagers who claimed they hated reading. Somehow, Rose's recommendations always proved perfect for reasons that customers discovered weeks or months later, long after they had forgotten where they had acquired the books that had changed their perspectives. When Rose died, Maya had inherited the bookshop along with its inventory, its debts, and its loyal but economically insufficient customer base. Maya had kept Between the Lines operational for 18 months, trying to honor her grandmother's legacy while simultaneously trying to understand what Rose had actually been doing during 4 decades of eccentric bookselling. But Maya lacked Rose's intuitive understanding of which books belonged with which readers, and she definitely lacked Rose's patience for customers who browsed for hours without purchasing anything, who treated the bookshop as a lending library, and who asked for recommendations based on emotional needs rather than genre preferences. After 18 months of declining sales and increasing frustration, Maya had sold Between the Lines to a developer who planned to convert the space into a trendy coffee shop that would serve expensive drinks to people who had no interest in the neighborhood's literary history, or the woman who had spent 40 years matching books to souls with the precision of a master craftsperson. Maya had used the money from the sale to pay off her student loans and Rose's medical debts, but she had kept 1 box of books from her grandmother's personal collection, volumes that Rose had marked with mysterious symbols and annotations that Maya couldn't decipher, but couldn't bear to sell. Now, 2 years after closing Between the Lines, Maya worked as a technical writer for a software company, creating instruction manuals and user guides that served practical purposes without requiring the kind of emotional intelligence that had made Rose's bookshop feel magical. Maya wrote documentation that helped people use products efficiently, which was useful work that paid well and required skills Maya possessed naturally. But Maya's job didn't require her to understand why certain stories called to certain readers, or how books could serve as bridges between people's current circumstances and their potential futures, or what Rose had meant when she said that the best bookshops were places where stories chose their own destinations. Maya had convinced herself that she didn't miss the mystery of bookselling, just as she had convinced herself that she didn't miss Rose's cryptic wisdom about narratives and connection, and the ways that winter turned the world into a library, where every snowflake told a unique story. But on this particular December evening, as Maya walked home from her office through the first snowfall of the season, she found herself remembering Rose's voice with painful clarity. Maya, this is when the world becomes a library. Maya looked up at the snow falling through the streetlights and tried to see stories instead of weather. She tried to understand what Rose had seen in winter that had made her treat the first snowfall like a celebration. She tried to feel connected to something larger than the practical inconvenience of snow that would make her commute more difficult and her heating bill more expensive. But all Maya saw was snow. Cold, wet, inconvenient snow that was already beginning to accumulate on sidewalks that would be treacherous by morning. Maya pulled her coat tighter and walked faster, eager to reach her apartment where she could close the curtains against winter and spend the evening working on documentation that served clear purposes and produced measurable results. She was walking past the narrow alley where Between the Lines used to be located when she saw the light. A shop that shouldn't exist. The light was impossible. Maya knew this with the certainty of someone who had walked this route home from work every day for 2 years, and had never seen anything in the alley except the construction equipment and renovation materials that marked the former bookshop's transformation into a coffee bar that would open in the spring. But tonight, warm, golden light spilled from the windows of a shop that occupied the exact space where Between the Lines had once been. The light was the kind that came from old-fashioned bulbs and well-maintained fixtures, the kind that made books look inviting and made customers want to linger among shelves that held promises of discovery. Maya stopped walking and stared at the storefront, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be logically possible. The developer had gutted Between the Lines 6 months ago, removing Rose's carefully arranged shelves, stripping the walls to bare brick, and installing industrial fixtures that would support the coffee shop's modern aesthetic. But the shop Maya was looking at now was identical to Between the Lines as it had existed during Rose's lifetime. The same hand-painted sign in gold lettering on dark green background. The same window display of carefully chosen books arranged to catch the attention of people who might not have known they were looking for something to read. The same narrow doorway that required customers to duck slightly, creating the impression that they were entering a secret space rather than a retail establishment. Maya approached the window and peered inside, expecting to see construction, materials or empty space or some explanation for light that was emanating from a building that shouldn't contain anything except renovation supplies. Instead, she saw shelves, hundreds of shelves, arranged with the same careful attention to flow and accessibility that Rose had maintained during 40 years of bookselling. The shelves extended further back into the building than Maya remembered, creating depths and corridors that seemed to bend space in ways that defied the architectural limitations of the narrow lot. More impossibly, the shelves were full. Not just full, but overflowing with books that seemed to organize and reorganize themselves as Maya watched. Volumes shifted position, rearranged themselves by some invisible logic, and occasionally floated from shelf to shelf as if they were seeking their proper places in a classification system that operated according to principles Maya couldn't identify. Maya looked for explanations that didn't require accepting that a bookshop that had been demolished 6 months ago was somehow operating normally in a space that should have been empty. Maybe the renovation had been delayed. Maybe the developer had decided to recreate Between the Lines as a nostalgic marketing strategy. Maybe Maya was experiencing some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by the first snowfall and memories of her grandmother. But the warm light was definitely real, and the books moving behind the window were definitely visible, and the sign that read Between the Lines was definitely identical to the one Rose had commissioned from a local artist 30 years ago. Maya pushed against the door, expecting it to be locked or to reveal the construction site she knew existed behind the impossible storefront. Instead, the door opened with the familiar bell that had announced customers during Rose's lifetime, and Maya found herself stepping into a bookshop that shouldn't exist, but felt more real than the winter evening she had just left behind. The interior was exactly as Maya remembered, but also somehow more than it had been. The shelves seemed taller and more numerous. The books seemed more vibrant and more varied. The lighting seemed warmer and more inviting. The entire space felt like an enhanced version of itself, as if someone had taken Between the Lines and amplified its essential bookshopness until it became the platonic ideal of what a bookshop could be when it existed primarily to serve books and readers, rather than profit margins and commercial efficiency. Maya stood in the doorway, letting snow melt from her coat while she tried to process the impossibility of what she was experiencing. Behind her, winter continued its practical business of making December evening more cold and more difficult. In front of her, Between the Lines existed in defiance of everything Maya understood about reality, renovation, and the permanent nature of demolition. She closed the door behind her and walked deeper into the bookshop, looking for an explanation that would restore her faith in logical causality and her understanding of what was possible on Tuesday evenings in December. What she found instead were books that knew her name. Books that knew her name. Maya was examining a shelf of poetry collections, trying to determine whether she recognized any of the titles from Rose's original inventory, when a volume slipped from its place among the other books and fell open on the floor at her feet. Maya knelt to pick it up, expecting to find a collection of sonnets or free verse or the kind of poetry that English teachers assigned to demonstrate that literature could be both beautiful and incomprehensible. Instead, she found a page that contained her own name written in Rose's distinctive handwriting. For Maya, who has forgotten that stories choose their readers and that some books wait decades for the right person to discover them at the right moment in their life. Maya stared at the "I" inscription, which appeared in a book she was certain she had never seen before, written in handwriting she would recognize anywhere but addressed to her in terms that seemed to respond to thoughts she had been having during her walk home from work. She flipped through the pages, finding poetry that seemed selected specifically for her current emotional state. Poems about loss and inheritance, about the difficulty of understanding what previous generations had tried to teach, about the responsibility that came with inheriting work you weren't sure you knew how to continue. Maya closed the poetry collection and placed it back on the shelf, where it immediately slipped sideways to lean against other volumes, as if making room for itself among books that had been waiting for it to join their collection. She moved to a different section of the bookshop, trying to find areas that looked like the between the lines she remembered rather than the enhanced version she was currently experiencing. But every shelf she examined contained books that seemed personally curated for her discovery. Novels about technical writers who discovered they were meant to do different work. Memoirs about women inheriting family businesses they didn't know how to operate. Collections of short stories about the mysterious connections between grandmothers and granddaughters who loved each other despite not understanding each other. Maya pulled a slim volume from a shelf marked "Family Mysteries" and found another inscription in Rose's handwriting. Maya, some stories can only be understood after the people who live them are no longer available to explain them. This doesn't make the stories less true. It makes them more important. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter evening she had left outside. Rose had been dead for 3 years. Between the Lines had been demolished 6 months ago. Maya was standing in a bookshop that couldn't exist, holding books that contained messages written by her dead grandmother and addressed to her present circumstances with impossible specificity. Maya opened the Family Mysteries volume and found a story titled "The Granddaughter Who Inherited a Secret." The story began. Maya had always known that her grandmother Rose was hiding something, but she had assumed it was something small and personal, like a secret recipe or a hidden savings account or a romantic correspondence from her youth. Maya had never imagined that Rose was, hiding an entire understanding of how stories worked, or that Rose's bookshop had been something more than a business, or that Maya's inheritance included responsibilities she had never been prepared to accept. Maya read the opening paragraph 3 times, feeling increasingly uncertain about the boundary between fiction and autobiography, between books that told stories and books that somehow knew the stories of the people reading them. She closed the volume and returned it to its shelf, where it nestled between other books as if it had always belonged there. She walked toward the back of the bookshop, where Rose used to keep her desk and her personal library, and the books that she claimed were not for sale, but available to the right readers at the right times. Maya found the desk exactly where it had always been, covered with Rose's familiar clutter: reading glasses, teacups, notebooks filled with customer recommendations, and a cash register that was somehow both antique and perfectly functional. Behind the desk, Rose's personal library occupied the same shelves it had inhabited during her lifetime, but the collection seemed to have expanded to include books Maya had never seen before. Maya approached the personal library and found a section marked "For Maya When She's Ready." The books in this section were all new editions, their spines unmarked by age or handling, their titles addressing subjects Maya hadn't known she needed to learn about: understanding, inherited gifts, the responsibilities of literary inheritance, how to run a bookshop for souls instead of sales, and the winter magic of books that choose their own readers. Maya pulled the last title from the shelf and opened it to find a letter from Rose, written in the familiar handwriting but dated just 1 week ago. The grandmother she never really knew. "My dearest Maya," Rose's letter began, "if you are reading this, you have discovered that Between the Lines was more than a bookshop, and that my death did not end my ability to provide you with the guidance you need to understand what you have inherited." Maya sat in Rose's desk chair, which adjusted itself to her height automatically, and read the impossible letter from her grandmother, who had been dead for 3 years, but was somehow still writing to her with perfect awareness of her current circumstances. "You closed Between the Lines because you thought I had left you a failing business that required skills you didn't possess. You were wrong about both the nature of what I left you and the skills required to continue it. Between the Lines was never a bookshop in the conventional sense. It was a place where stories found their way to the people who needed them most, regardless of those people's ability to pay market prices for the privilege of literary connection." Maya paused in her reading to look around the bookshop that was somehow operational, despite having been demolished, somehow fully stocked, despite having had its inventory sold, somehow warm and welcoming despite existing in a space that should have been empty construction site. "The books in Between the Lines have always been alive in ways that other books are not," Rose's letter continued. "They choose their readers based on need rather than preference, and they reveal their contents according to what each reader is ready to understand, rather than what each reader thinks they want to learn. This is why my customers often left with books they hadn't intended to purchase, and why those books invariably proved perfect for circumstances the customers encountered weeks or months later." Maya thought about her summers working at Between the Lines, when she had watched Rose recommend books with mysterious confidence and had seen customers return months later to thank Rose for providing exactly what they had needed, even though they hadn't known they needed it when they made their purchases. "You thought I was simply intuitive about matching books to readers," Rose's letter continued. "But intuition was only part of my work at Between the Lines. The more important part was learning to listen to what the books themselves wanted to accomplish, and then trusting them to find their way to readers who could benefit from their particular forms of wisdom." Maya looked up from the letter to observe the books around her, which seemed to be subtly rearranging themselves as she watched. Volumes shifted position, moved from shelf to shelf, and organized themselves according to principles that had nothing to do with alphabetical order, genre classification, or publication date. Rose's letter addressed this phenomenon directly. The books in Between the Lines arrange themselves according to the needs of current and potential customers. They know when someone is approaching the shop who would benefit from their contents, and they position themselves to be easily discovered by the people who need to find them. This is why the shop's organization seemed random to you during your summers working here, and why I never had to direct customers to specific sections or titles. The books did that work themselves. Maya remembered her frustration with Between the Lines' apparently haphazard organization, and her failed attempts to impose rational classification systems that Rose had patiently undone after Maya returned to school each fall. "Maya, you have inherited not just a bookshop, but a responsibility to maintain a place where stories and readers can find each other without interference from commercial considerations or conventional retail logic," Rose's letter continued. "Between the Lines appears only during the first snowfall of winter because that is when people are most likely to need the kinds of books that choose their own readers. Winter makes people introspective, contemplative, and open to discovering things about themselves that they ignore during busier seasons." Maya looked out the window at the snow that was still falling, transforming the alley into exactly the kind of scene that appeared on the greeting cards she had always found artificially sentimental. "This is why I loved winter, Maya. Not because I enjoyed cold weather, but because winter was when Between the Lines became most itself. A place where the boundary between stories and real life became permeable enough for books to work their particular magic on people who were ready to be transformed by reading." Rose's letter concluded with instructions that sounded both practical and mystical. "Between the Lines will remain open as long as you are willing to serve as its keeper. You don't need to understand how the books choose their readers, or why some stories appear only when specific people need to read them. You only need to trust that books know what they want to accomplish, and to provide space for literary connections that transcend commercial transaction." Maya set down the letter and looked around the bookshop that had somehow reconstituted itself for her discovery. She understood now that Rose had been trying to teach her something during those summer jobs that had nothing to do with retail sales and everything to do with facilitating relationships between stories and souls. But Maya also understood that accepting responsibility for between the lines would mean believing in forms of magic that challenged everything she thought she knew about how books, readers, and bookshops operated, according to rational principles. Maya was considering whether she was ready to make that leap of faith when she heard the bell that announced a customer's arrival, and she realized that the first test of her willingness to serve as keeper of between the lines was walking through the door. Stories that write themselves. The customer was a man in his 50s, wearing a coat that suggested he had been walking through the snow for longer than was comfortable, but had continued walking anyway because he had been looking for something he couldn't name, and had somehow found himself outside a bookshop that glowed with impossible warmth in an alley where no bookshop should exist. "Excuse me," the man said, shaking snow from his coat while looking around the shop with the expression of someone who had expected to find something entirely different. "I'm looking for, well, I'm not sure what I'm looking for. I was walking, and I saw the light, and I thought maybe..." Maya understood that this was the moment when she could either embrace Rose's mysterious approach to bookselling or explain that the shop was closed, that she wasn't actually qualified to recommend books, and that the customer should probably visit a normal bookstore that operated according to comprehensible principles. Instead, Maya heard herself saying, "What kind of story do you need?" The man looked surprised by the question, as if he had expected to be asked about his reading preferences or his favorite genres rather than his existential requirements for narrative intervention. "I'm not sure," he said. "I lost my job 3 months ago. I lost my wife 2 years ago. I've been trying to figure out what comes next, but I don't know how to start over. When starting over feels like admitting that everything I built for 30 years wasn't worth building." Maya felt completely unqualified to provide literary counseling to a stranger who was experiencing major life transitions and needed books that could help him navigate grief, unemployment, and the challenge of reconstructing identity in middle age. But as Maya was preparing to explain her lack of relevant expertise, she noticed that several books had moved from their shelves and were now positioned prominently on the counter near the cash register, as if they had been waiting for this specific customer and had arranged themselves for easy discovery. Maya approached the counter and found 3 volumes that seemed selected with impossible precision for the man's described circumstances, a memoir about rebuilding life after loss, a practical guide to career transitions for people over 50, and a novel about a widower who discovers that starting over requires accepting help from unexpected sources. "These seem like they might be useful," Maya said, gesturing toward the books that had somehow chosen themselves for this customer's particular needs. The man examined the titles with growing amazement. "How did you know? I mean, these are..." "Exactly. How did you know what I needed?" Maya almost explained that she hadn't known anything, that the books had somehow selected themselves, that she was as surprised as he was by the apparent perfection of the match between his needs and their contents. Instead, she heard herself channeling Rose's approach to impossible questions about literary matchmaking. "Books know things about us that we don't always know about ourselves," Maya said. "Sometimes the best way to find what you need is to let the right story find you." The man purchased all 3 books, paid with exact change that he somehow had despite not having planned to visit a bookshop, and left with the expression of someone who had received not just books, but permission to believe that his life could contain new chapters even after experiencing losses that had felt like permanent endings. After he left, Maya looked at the counter where the 3 books had arranged themselves for his discovery. The space was now occupied by different books entirely, volumes that seemed chosen for entirely different circumstances and entirely different readers. Maya realized that she had just experienced her first successful customer interaction as keeper of between the lines, and that she had succeeded not by applying retail skills or literary knowledge, but by trusting books to identify their own ideal readers and by serving as facilitator rather than decision-maker in the process of literary connection. Over the next 2 hours, Maya helped 6 more customers find books that seemed impossibly perfect for their circumstances. A college student struggling with anxiety left with a collection of essays about managing uncertainty. A retired teacher missing her former sense of purpose left with a novel about mentorship that continued across generations. A teenager dealing with his parents' divorce left with a young adult novel about families that love each other despite being unable to live together successfully. In each case, Maya's role had been minimal, greeting customers, facilitating payment, and occasionally asking questions that helped clarify what kind of story each person needed. The books had done the actual work of selection, positioning themselves where they could be easily discovered by the people who would benefit most from their particular forms of wisdom. Maya was beginning to understand what Rose had meant about books choosing their own readers, and why Between the Lines had operated according to principles that prioritized need over profit, connection over commerce, and trust in literary magic over conventional retail logic. But Maya was also beginning to understand that serving as keeper of Between the Lines would require accepting responsibility for something that challenged her fundamental assumptions about how the world worked, how businesses operated, and how books related to the people who read them. Maya was contemplating this responsibility when she noticed that one section of the bookshop was glowing more brightly than the others, as if certain books were demanding her attention for reasons that had nothing to do with customer service and everything to do with her own need to understand what Rose had really been doing during 40 years of mysterious bookselling. The truth hidden between pages. The glowing section was Rose's collection of personal books, the volumes she had claimed were not for sale, but available to the right readers at the right times. Maya had always assumed this collection contained Rose's favorite books, the volumes she had read and reread and wanted to keep for her own reference and enjoyment. But as Maya approached the glowing shelves, she realized that Rose's personal collection consisted entirely of books about Maya herself, not books that Maya had written. She had never written anything except technical documentation for software companies. These were books that had somehow been written about Maya's life, her experiences, her relationships, her choices, and her potential futures. The titles read like a comprehensive biography of someone whose life had been considered worth documenting in extensive detail. Maya Chen's childhood, the formation of a future bookkeeper. Maya's college years, learning to write instructions instead of stories. The summer Maya learned to love books without understanding them. Maya's inheritance, the bookshop she almost destroyed. Maya's return, the night she discovered her true calling. Maya pulled the last volume from the shelf and opened it to find a detailed account of this very evening, written with the precision of someone who had observed her discovery of Between the Lines and had documented her interactions with customers and her growing understanding of her role as keeper of literary magic. But the book didn't end with her current moment of discovery. It continued with chapters that described Maya's future as keeper of Between the Lines, her gradual mastery of the facilitating connections between books and readers, her expansion of the bookshop services to include literary counseling and story-based therapy, her training of other people who wanted to learn how to operate bookshops that served souls instead of sales figures. Maya read about versions of herself that seemed both plausible and impossible, a Maya who had learned to trust books to choose their own readers, a Maya who had developed intuitive understanding of which stories would serve which people's needs, a Maya who had built a life around facilitating the kind of literary connections that transformed readers' understanding of themselves and their circumstances. But the book also contained chapters about choices Maya could make that would lead to entirely different futures. A Maya who returned to technical writing and never reopened Between the Lines, a Maya who tried to operate the bookshop according to conventional retail principles and gradually lost its magical properties, a Maya who became overwhelmed by the responsibility of serving as keeper of literary magic and closed the shop permanently rather than risk failing to honor Rose's legacy. Maya realized that she was reading not just about her potential futures, but about the consequences of different choices she could make about whether to accept the responsibility Rose had tried to leave her. The books don't just choose their readers, Maya said aloud, addressing the empty bookshop that somehow felt full of listening presence. They write their own stories about what happens when readers find the books they need. As if responding to her recognition, the entire bookshop began to glow more brightly. Books rearranged themselves with visible enthusiasm, creating new organizational patterns that seemed designed to accommodate different types of readers and different forms of literary need. Shelves extended themselves deeper into the building, creating additional space for books that were apparently materializing from wherever books came from when they were needed by readers who didn't yet know they needed them. Maya understood that she was witnessing Between the Lines expanding itself in preparation for serving more customers handling more complex literary connections, and facilitating forms of book-to-reader matching that would require space for larger inventories and more sophisticated organizational systems. She also understood that this expansion was happening because she had demonstrated willingness to serve as keeper of the bookshop, and that the books were preparing for futures that assumed she would commit to learning whatever skills were necessary to help stories find their way to the people who needed them most. Maya was ready to accept this responsibility, but she also had questions about the practical logistics of operating a magical bookshop during the 11 months of the year when it apparently didn't exist in any form that allowed customers to visit it. Maya was formulating these questions when she heard the bell that announced another customer's arrival, and she looked toward the door expecting to see someone seeking books that would address their particular needs. Instead, she saw Rose. When winter ends and magic fades, Rose looked exactly as Maya remembered her, small and energetic, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see stories everywhere she looked. She wore the same green cardigan she had favored during her final years, and she carried the same canvas bag she had used for transporting books between the shop and her apartment. "Hello, Maya," Rose said, approaching the counter where Maya stood with the book about her own potential futures still open in her hands. "I've been waiting for you to find your way here." Maya wanted to ask the obvious questions about how Rose could be present in the bookshop when she had been dead for 3 years, about how Between the Lines could exist when it had been demolished 6 months ago, about how books could choose their own readers and write stories about the people who discovered them. Instead, Maya found herself asking the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you tell me any of this while you were alive?" Rose smiled with the patient expression she had worn when Maya asked questions that required complex answers. "Because you weren't ready to believe in the kinds of magic that make Between the Lines possible. You needed to discover the limitations of conventional approaches to work and life before you could appreciate the advantages of serving purposes larger than practical necessity." Rose gestured around the bookshop, which continued to glow with warm light that seemed to emanate from the books themselves rather than from any electrical fixtures. Between the Lines exists in the spaces between ordinary reality and the reality that becomes possible when people choose to believe in forms of connection that transcend rational explanation. Maya looked at the book in her hands, which contained detailed descriptions of her potential futures, depending on the choices she made about accepting responsibility for literary magic. "The books wrote stories about my life before I lived it." "The books write stories about all their potential readers," Rose said. "They understand that every person who might discover them has multiple possible futures, and they prepare narratives that correspond to the different choices people might make about what kinds of lives they want to create." Rose moved behind the counter and began organizing books with the practiced efficiency Maya remembered from her childhood visits to Between the Lines. But the books only write happy endings for people who choose to trust in the connections between stories and souls, between individual needs and collective wisdom, between the work that serves personal comfort and the work that serves purposes larger than individual satisfaction. Maya watched Rose handle books with the familiar reverence she had brought to her role as literary matchmaker for 40 years. "What happens to Between the Lines when winter ends?" "It waits," Rose said simply. "The books return to wherever books exist when they're not needed by specific readers. The shelves fold themselves back into possibility. The space becomes available for other purposes until the first snowfall of the next winter, when it reconstitutes itself for people who need the kinds of stories that choose their own readers." "And what happens to me during the 11 months when the bookshop doesn't exist?" Rose smiled with the expression of someone who had been waiting to answer this particular question. "You learn to see the world as a library, Maya. You learn to recognize that books and readers find each other everywhere, not just in bookshops. You learn to facilitate literary connections in your daily life, in your other work, in your relationships with people who don't realize they need stories that could help them understand themselves better." Rose pulled a book from the shelf behind the counter and handed it to Maya. The title read, "How to Serve as a Literary Matchmaker in Ordinary Life, a Guide for Keepers of Between the Lines." "Maya, you've spent 3 years thinking that I left you a failing business that you couldn't operate successfully. I actually left you a calling that will transform every aspect of your life if you choose to accept it. Between the Lines is just the visible manifestation of work that continues year-round, everywhere that stories and people intersect." Maya opened the guidebook and found practical advice for recognizing when people needed specific types of stories, techniques for recommending books in casual conversation, and strategies for creating literary connections in workplace settings, social situations, and family relationships. "You want me to become you," Maya said, understanding suddenly that Rose's approach to life had been shaped entirely by her commitment to serving as intermediary between stories and souls. "I want you to become yourself," Rose corrected gently, "but I want you to become the version of yourself that chooses to serve purposes larger than personal comfort, that trusts in forms of connection that transcend practical explanation, and that finds satisfaction in work that benefits people you may never meet in ways you may never fully understand." Maya looked around between the lines, which felt more real and more important than any workplace she had ever inhabited. She thought about her job creating technical documentation, which served useful purposes, but didn't create the kinds of transformative connections she had witnessed during her evening as keeper of the bookshop. What if I'm not good at this? What if I can't learn to trust books to choose their own readers, or to facilitate the kinds of literary connections you made for 40 years? Rose reached across the counter and took Maya's hands with the warmth Maya remembered from childhood visits when Rose had seemed to know exactly which books would expand Maya's understanding of herself and her possibilities. "Maya, you've already demonstrated that you can do this work. You helped 7 customers find exactly the books they needed tonight, and you did it by trusting the books, rather than trying to control the process. You have the only qualification that matters for serving as keeper of Between the Lines. You care more about helping people find the stories they need than about protecting yourself from the vulnerability that comes with believing in literary magic." Rose released Maya's hands and stepped back, her form beginning to become slightly translucent as dawn light started to filter through the bookshop windows. "The sun is rising, Maya. Winter's first snow is ending, and Between the Lines will fade until next year's first snowfall. You have a choice to make about whether you want to serve as its keeper, and you have 11 months to learn how to facilitate literary connections in ordinary life before the bookshop needs you again." Maya looked toward the windows, where early morning light was indeed beginning to replace the golden glow that had emanated from the books throughout the night. "Will I see you again?" Rose smiled with love that transcended the practical limitations of death and physical presence. "You'll see me every time you help someone find a story that transforms their understanding of themselves. You'll hear me every time you trust books to choose their own readers instead of trying to control literary connections through rational analysis. You'll feel me every time you choose to serve purposes larger than personal comfort." As dawn light grew stronger, Rose's form became fainter, and the books around Maya began to fade as well, returning to wherever books existed when they weren't needed by specific readers at specific moments in their lives. "Maya," Rose said as her voice became whisper quiet, "some stories choose their readers across generations. You are my story's continuation, and the books that find their way to you during the next 11 months are your preparation for becoming the keeper Between the Lines needs you to become." The final chapter. She had to write. Maya found herself standing in an empty construction site, surrounded by renovation materials and the skeletal framework of what would become a coffee shop when construction resumed in the spring. Snow continued to fall through the pre-dawn darkness, but the magical warmth that had surrounded Between the Lines during the night was gone, replaced by the ordinary December cold that Maya had always associated with winter's practical inconveniences. Maya looked down at her hands and found that she was still holding the guidebook Rose had given her. How to Serve as a Literary Matchmaker in Ordinary Life, a guide for keepers of Between the Lines. The book felt solid and real, its pages filled with practical advice for facilitating literary connections outside the context of a magical bookshop that appeared only during winter's first snowfall. Maya walked home through streets where ordinary people were beginning their ordinary morning routines, carrying her first assignment as keeper of Between the Lines, learning to see the world as a library where stories and readers found each other through connections that transcended the boundaries of bookshops and business hours. Over the following weeks, Maya began experimenting with Rose's approach to literary matchmaking in her daily life. She recommended books to co-workers who mentioned personal challenges during coffee breaks. She left carefully selected volumes in the break room at her office, with notes suggesting that they were available to anyone who might find them useful. She began conversations with strangers about what they were reading and discovered that people were often grateful for book recommendations that addressed their circumstances with surprising specificity. Maya found that she was developing intuitive understanding of which stories would serve which people's needs, and that books seemed to find their way into her possession exactly when she encountered people who would benefit from reading them. She began to understand what Rose had meant about seeing the world as a library and about serving as intermediary between stories and souls, regardless of whether that service took place in an official bookshop. By spring, Maya had facilitated dozens of literary connections that had helped people navigate relationship difficulties, career changes, family conflicts, and personal crises. She had learned to trust that books knew what they wanted to accomplish, and that her role was to provide space for literary connections rather than to control or direct them. Maya had also learned that serving as literary matchmaker was more satisfying than any work she had ever done, because it created connections between people and stories that transformed readers' understanding of themselves and their possibilities. When the coffee shop opened in the space where Between the Lines had once been located, Maya became one of its regular customers. She brought books to read while drinking coffee, and she discovered that the coffee shop attracted people who were dealing with life transitions, relationship challenges, and existential questions that could be addressed through connections with appropriate stories. Maya began leaving carefully selected books on the coffee shop tables, with notes suggesting that they were free to good homes or available to anyone who might find them useful. She struck up conversations with other customers about what they were reading, and she found that people were often eager to discuss books that had helped them navigate difficult circumstances. The coffee shop owner eventually approached Maya about her informal literary matchmaking activities, concerned that she might be turning his business into an unauthorized lending library. But when Maya explained that she was simply sharing books with people who seemed to need them, the owner became interested in incorporating literary connection into his business model. Maya proposed establishing a community book exchange corner in the coffee shop where customers could leave books they had finished reading and find books that other customers recommended. The owner agreed to the experiment, and Maya curated the initial collection using principles she had learned from Rose about matching books to readers based on need rather than genre preference. The community book exchange became one of the coffee shop's most popular features, attracting customers who came specifically to discover books that had been recommended by people who understood the transformative power of literary connection. Maya realized that she had successfully transformed the space where Between the Lines had once existed into a different kind of literary hub, one that operated year-round and served a broader community of readers who were seeking stories that could help them understand themselves and their circumstances better. As the first anniversary of her discovery of Between the Lines approached, Maya prepared for the winter evening when the magical bookshop would appear again in the alley where the coffee shop now operated. She had spent 11 months learning to serve as literary matchmaker in ordinary life, and she was ready to apply those skills to serving as keeper of a bookshop, where books chose their own readers, and stories wrote themselves about the people who discovered them. Between the Lines of Love and Loss. On the first snowy evening of Maya's 2nd December as keeper of Between the Lines, she walked to the alley where the coffee shop occupied the space during 11 months of the year, and where the magical bookshop appeared during winter's first snowfall. She carried with her a notebook filled with observations about literary connections she had facilitated during the past year, and a deeper understanding of what Rose had been trying to teach her about serving purposes larger than personal comfort. As snow began to fall more heavily, Maya watched the coffee shop fade and Between the Lines reconstitute itself with the same impossible specificity she remembered from the previous year. The warm golden light, the shelves that extended deeper into the building than architecture should allow, the books that arranged themselves according to the needs of potential readers. But this year, Maya approached Between the Lines not as a confused inheritor of responsibilities she didn't understand, but as someone who had spent 11 months preparing to serve as keeper of literary magic. Maya unlocked the door with a key that appeared in her pocket exactly when she needed it, and she entered Between the Lines with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The bookshop welcomed her with the same warm glow she remembered, but she also sensed that it had expanded its capabilities based on her year of learning to facilitate literary connections in ordinary life. The shelves contained not just the books Maya remembered from the previous year, but also books that seemed chosen specifically for the people she had met during her year of serving as informal literary matchmaker. Volumes that would benefit her coworkers, her coffee shop acquaintances, the strangers she had encountered who needed stories that could help them navigate their particular circumstances. Maya realized that Between the Lines had been collecting books throughout the year based on her growing understanding of which stories served which people's needs, and that the bookshop was preparing to serve an expanded community of readers who had been influenced by Maya's year-round literary matchmaking activities. Over the course of the winter evening, Maya helped dozens of customers find books that seemed impossibly perfect for their circumstances. But she also noticed that many of the customers were people she had met during the previous year, co-workers who had benefited from her book recommendations, coffee shop acquaintances who had discovered transformative stories through the community book exchange, strangers who had been influenced by literary connections Maya had facilitated in casual conversation. Maya understood that her year of serving as literary matchmaker in ordinary life had created a community of people who were drawn to Between the Lines because they had learned to trust in the power of stories to provide guidance, comfort, and transformation during difficult circumstances. As dawn approached and Between the Lines prepared to fade until the following year's first snowfall, Maya reflected on what she had learned about inheritance, responsibility, and the kinds of work that served purposes larger than personal satisfaction. Rose had left her not just a bookshop, but a calling that had transformed every aspect of her life. Maya had learned to see strangers as potential readers who needed specific stories, to trust that books knew what they wanted to accomplish, and to find deep satisfaction in work that created connections between people and narratives that helped them understand themselves better. Maya had also learned that some gifts could only be appreciated after the people who gave them were no longer available to explain their significance, and that the best way to honor inherited wisdom was to apply it creatively to circumstances the previous generation couldn't have anticipated. As Between the Lines faded with the first light of dawn, Maya understood that she would spend the next 11 months continuing to serve as literary matchmaker in ordinary life, preparing for another winter evening when the magical bookshop would appear for people who needed the kinds of stories that chose their own readers. Maya walked home through the ordinary December morning carrying extraordinary understanding of her purpose in life, to serve as intermediary between stories and souls, to facilitate connections that transcended rational explanation, and to trust that books knew more about what people needed than people knew about themselves. Maya had finally understood what Rose had meant when she said that winter turned the world into a library, where every snowflake told a unique story. The stories weren't in the snowflakes themselves. They were in the connections between people who were willing to believe that books could choose their readers, that stories could transform understanding, and that some work was worth doing simply because it helped strangers find the narratives they needed to navigate their particular circumstances with greater wisdom and hope. Maya Chen, keeper of Between the Lines, walked through the first snowfall of winter, carrying 11 months of preparation for serving purposes larger than herself, and looking forward to a lifetime of facilitating literary connections that would help books find their way to the people who needed them most. Behind her, the construction site where a coffee shop would resume operation in the spring held the invisible presence of a bookshop that existed in the spaces between ordinary reality and the reality that became possible when people chose to believe in the transformative power of stories told by books that knew exactly which readers needed to discover them at exactly the right moments in their lives. Some magic was seasonal, but the connections it created lasted all year long.